San Diego in the 1990s was, in many ways, a very different city from the bustling, increasingly polished metropolis it has become today. Back then, it still had a strong small-town undercurrent, a kind of relaxed, low-key rhythm that set it apart from cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco. It carried remnants of a sleepy border town identity that had endured through the 70s and 80s, especially in its less developed areas. The edges of the city felt almost rural, and the general pace of life was slower, more forgiving. Crossing the border into Tijuana was still an easy, spontaneous affair. You didn't need a passport, paperwork, or much of a plan, just a quick, confident American to the border guards and you were in ready for street tacos, tequila, or a night of unpredictable adventure. It was the kind of cross-cultural proximity that gave San Diego an extra dimension, a double life of sorts, and it was all within reach. Air quality, while not perfect, was noticeably better than today's haze-choked skyline. Smog rolled in on occasion, especially during certain parts of the year, but it didn't linger with the same weight. You could actually see the stars at night from many neighborhoods. Rent prices were manageable for the average working person. A single-income household could afford a modest apartment or even a small house without the crushing anxiety that now comes standard with San Diego real estate. Parking at the beach in summer, while still competitive, didn't require tactical warfare or psychic timing. You could cruise into Mission Beach or La Jolla Shores on a weekend and reasonably expect to find a spot without offering a blood sacrifice. The city's skyline remained modest, with only a handful of tall buildings downtown. Nothing like the glass and steel high-rises that now dominate the horizon. Streets were quieter, too. There wasn't as much constant traffic, and the roads weren't yet packed with ride shares, scooters, and out-of-town drivers streaming in for conferences and Airbnb getaways. There was an overarching sense of laid-back calm that wrapped around the city like a warm blanket. That vibe was especially strong in neighborhoods like Mira Mesa, Ocean Beach, and North Park. These were the places where locals actually lived, where kids grew up playing in cul-de-sacs, where taco shops outnumbered Starbucks, and where the concept of luxury apartments was mostly reserved for La Jolla and Coronado. In the early part of the decade, much of North County still felt like the edge of civilization. It was the kind of place where you could still find open fields, riding trails, and the occasional patch of wilderness nestled between developing neighborhoods. Carmel Valley wasn't a sea of stucco and strip malls yet. It was a semi-rural expanse dotted with horse ranches, with actual open sky above and room to breathe. Mira Mesa, now one of the city's most densely populated suburbs, was bordered by undeveloped land and empty dirt lots. Kids spent their afternoons riding BMX bikes through what would eventually become cookie-cutter housing tracts and bustling retail centers. The stretch of road that would become State Route 56 existed mainly as a dusty, unofficial shortcut for off-roaders looking to cut across the city without getting bogged down in traditional traffic routes. Lakeside was dry and sun-baked, with more headlines about drug busts than real estate development, yet it maintained a scrappy, self-reliant local culture that made it feel more like a small town than part of a major city. People today often say traffic was better back then, and that's true, but only relatively. Rush hour still existed, especially on the 805, the 5, and the 15, but the daily grind was less suffocating. You could actually live within a reasonable distance from your job and not have your commute consume hours of your life. Gas was cheaper, parking was easier, and freeways, while clogged at times, didn't feel like parking lots 24/7. The urban sprawl hadn't yet reached its breaking point, and the city still felt navigable. Throughout the decade, many neighborhoods began to transform, each with its own rhythm and trajectory. Hillcrest and North Park started evolving from overlooked zones into vibrant, culture-rich communities. They weren't yet fully gentrified, but the seeds were being planted. Artists, musicians, and members of the gay community were moving in, drawn by the low rents and relative creative freedom. Bars like The Flame and various independent coffee shops started popping up, offering safe spaces, live music, poetry readings, and late-night conversations that could go until 2 a.m. or later. Rent was still reasonable. Even in these emerging hip pockets, it wasn't uncommon to find a decent one-bedroom apartment for around $600 a month. And you didn't need a real estate agent, a trust fund, or a winning lottery ticket to lock it down. Word of mouth was still king. Downtown San Diego, far from its current sleek and sanitized version, was still in its gritty, transitional phase. The East Village, now known for high-rise condos, breweries, and art galleries, was back then an industrial zone full of crumbling warehouses, dusty lots, auto shops, and a smattering of secondhand stores and forgotten diners. It was a place you passed through, not hung out in. The gas lamp quarter was just beginning to stir with promise, shifting from seedy and half-abandoned to something resembling a nightlife district. But even then, it retained an edge, a kind of DIY spirit that made the area feel raw and unpredictable rather than curated and commercial. There were clubs and dive bars where you could catch live music. But you might also see a fistfight break out on the sidewalk at 1 a.m. Horton Plaza, bizarrely designed and slightly disorienting, was the commercial centerpiece of downtown. With its multicolored facades, ramps that led to nowhere, and angular corridors, it looked like something out of a Salvador Dali painting or a video game level. Getting lost was half the fun. Teens and 20-somethings would roam its levels aimlessly, grabbing slices of pizza, trying on clothes at Hot Topic, or just killing time. Everyone knew the trick. Buy a stick of gum at the food court, get your parking validated, and enjoy hours of free downtown parking. It was one of those unspoken San Diego hacks that every local knew about. In Mission Valley during the 1990s, life moved at a noticeably more relaxed pace. The area felt more suburban than commercial, and the constant churn of development hadn't yet fully swallowed it up. Fashion Valley Mall, now a sprawling and upscale shopping destination, was smaller, simpler, and easier to navigate. It had fewer high-end stores and more practical retailers that appealed to families, teenagers, and the casual weekend browser. Over at Mission Valley Center, So's Restaurant, owned by Chargers legend Junior So, stood as a local institution. It wasn't just a place to grab a meal. It was a destination, a sports shrine, and a reliable place to see Chargers memorabilia up close. Just a short walk away, the AMC Theater was the main draw for moviegoers in the area. It was the kind of place where teens loitered in packs on Friday nights, parents brought kids for matinees, and couples ducked into dark theaters for second dates. These were landmarks in a time when the city still felt spread out and slightly sleepy. Jack Murphy Stadium, the multi-purpose sports coliseum looming nearby, served as the heartbeat of local sports culture. Whether it was Padres baseball games during the summer or tailgate-heavy Chargers Sundays in the fall, the stadium had a gritty, lived-in energy that united fans from across the county. It hadn't yet gone corporate with the Qualcomm name change, and the concrete bowl, while far from glamorous, held decades of memories. Around this time, the San Diego Trolley was slowly evolving into something more useful. Its bright red cars were a novelty at first, touristy and underutilized. But by 1992, when the Mission Valley extension was completed, Trolley began to show signs of real utility. People could now travel between downtown and Mission Valley more easily. And for those without cars, this was no small thing. It didn't make public transportation perfect, far from it. But it was a step in the right direction, in a city still designed around car culture. Food culture in 1990s, San Diego was unpretentious, incredibly affordable, and more often than not, delicious. There weren't Instagrammable brunches or curated tasting menus. What the city had was hole-in-the-wall gems and cash-only joints that served some of the best food you could get for under $5. Carne asada burritos from taco shops like Roberto's or Codixon weren't just meals. They were late-night rituals, post-surf fuel, or hangover cures for locals across the county. The meat was flavorful. The guacamole was always over-applied, and the foil wrap kept everything together in the messiest, most satisfying way. A bowl of pho from a Vietnamese joint in City Heights or Linda Vista was $3 to $4, served by a staff that didn't have time for small talk and didn't need to because the broth spoke for itself. These places didn't have Yelp reviews or decor budgets, just loyal customers and a reputation built word of mouth. Diner cups, buses, cafeteria trays, and even some doctor's offices were still stamped with that iconic jazz design. Those wavy blue and purple stripes on white that somehow ended up everywhere. It was the unspoken pattern of the decade, seeping into daily life without anyone realizing it. Music, too, was everywhere, and San Diego's scene in the 90s was far more influential than outsiders gave it credit for. The city may not have had the fame of Seattle or LA, but it had grit, originality, and talent in spades. Soma, then located on Union Street downtown, was a key venue for local and touring acts, especially punk, ska, and early emo bands. It was a place where sweat dripped from the ceiling, mosh pits swallowed teenagers whole, and countless legendary shows unfolded in front of tiny, passionate crowds. Local bands like No Knife, Rocket from the Crypt, and Drive Like Jehu gave San Diego a sharp, unique sound that was deeply respected in underground music circles. Gravity Records, with its DIY ethos and raw production, turned out releases that would influence hardcore and screamo scenes far beyond Southern California. The larger Street Scene Festival downtown was still in its prime, sprawling, chaotic, and full of surprises. The lineups made no sense in the best way possible. Hip-hop legends sharing space with jazz bands, indie rock next to blues, Latin acts warming up crowds before punk headliners. It wasn't curated for cool. It was a celebration of all the sounds the city could hold. Out near the coast, the beach communities pulsed with their own rhythms. Bonfires in Pacific Beach and Mission Beach drew acoustic guitars and conga drums. And even if you weren't playing, you were welcome to hang. Ocean Beach, in particular, retained its crusty surf bum charm, still full of head shops, VW vans, and the kind of locals who seemed frozen in time. Gentrification hadn't yet softened its edges. Infrastructure in the early part of the decade began to change the way San Diegans moved around. The expansion of freeway systems played a major role in shaping modern commutes. The completion of State Route 52 connected Sante and Tierra Santa to the rest of the city more efficiently, cutting travel times and boosting development. The infamous 805 and I-5, merged near Sorrento Valley, was widened in an attempt to alleviate bottlenecks. Though even then, it was clear that no amount of asphalt could outrun traffic growth forever. In the education space, UC San Marcos opened its doors in 1990. It was small, quiet, and not yet taken seriously as a major university, but it gave North County students a local option and slowly began developing its own academic culture. Up north, the Wild Animal Park, now the San Diego Zoo Safari Park, was still a major draw for families, field trips, and tourists wanting a more open, expansive animal experience than the urban zoo in Balboa Park. And the North County Fair Mall in Escondido remained a commercial hub for inland families before online shopping would render malls more ornamental than essential. Culturally, San Diego was more localized and raw around the edges. The city wasn't yet obsessed with branding or influencers. There was no real concept of aesthetic. People didn't choose restaurants based on lighting for photos. They went where the food was good or where their friends were. Hookah bars became popular toward the late 90s, especially with college kids and recent grads who wanted somewhere cheap to hang out without the full-on bar vibe. They were often dimly lit, vaguely Mediterranean, and heavy with sweet-smelling smoke. Before craft beer took over and breweries popped up on every block, these hookah lounges were the city's version of third spaces. Meanwhile, Comic-Con still felt like a comic book convention. You didn't need to plan a year in advance or sleep on the sidewalk. It was niche, casual, and oddly quiet compared to the spectacle it would eventually become. Just rows of tables, boxes of old issues, artists signing sketchbooks, and fans actually talking to each other about stories and characters, not just posing for cameras. The city wasn't without its problems, and in the 1990s, some of those problems felt deeply rooted and hard to shake. One of the most serious and well-known issues was the methamphetamine epidemic. At one point, San Diego earned the unwanted reputation of being the meth capital of the United States. From East County to the South Bay, meth labs were being raided at alarming rates, and local news regularly ran stories about drug busts, addiction, and the toll it was taking on both individuals and entire communities. Law enforcement agencies scrambled to keep up, but the cheap cost of meth and its easy availability meant that usage kept spreading through high schools, trailer parks, and working-class neighborhoods. It wasn't just a party drug, it was a crisis, and it quietly defined an undercurrent of daily life for many families struggling to keep it together. Gangs were another major issue that cast a long shadow over certain parts of the city. Neighborhoods like Southeast San Diego, Lincoln Park, and parts of City Heights saw an increase in gang-related violence during the early and mid-1990s. Drive-by shootings, turf wars, and graffiti weren't just urban legends. They were real fears for people who lived in those communities. Families would sometimes rearrange furniture to keep beds away from windows, and kids learned quickly what colors not to wear. Police-community relations were tense, with accusations of over-policing on one hand and calls for more safety on the other. For many, it felt like walking a tightrope between protection and profiling. Environmental issues weren't absent either. Smog from Los Angeles often drifted south during the Santa Ana wind conditions, creating a thick haze that settled over the city for days at a time. Mornings in neighborhoods like Claremont or Kearny Mesa sometimes started with a brown-gray layer sitting just above the skyline. It wasn't unusual to wake up with itchy eyes or a dry throat, especially if you spent a lot of time outdoors. People joked that you didn't need to smoke anything to feel it in your lungs. It was just the price of living in Southern California, and most locals accepted it with a shrug. Economically, San Diego took some hits too. Tourism, a major pillar of the city's revenue, slumped in the mid-1990s during the California recession. Families cut back on vacations, hotels saw lower occupancy, and even the once busy boardwalks around Mission Beach and Pacific Beach thinned out. Businesses that had once thrived on out-of-towners had to adapt or close their doors. The military presence, while still a major economic driver, also saw some instability as base closures and federal cutbacks loomed throughout the decade. Meanwhile, homelessness became a growing concern, particularly in downtown San Diego and along the Embarcadero. Though it wasn't as widespread or visible as it would become in later decades, the early signs were there. Tents tucked under freeway overpasses, people sleeping in doorways, shelters at capacity. It was becoming harder to ignore, even for the most insulated neighborhoods. Yet, for all of its challenges, San Diego was still, at its core, a city where people could afford to live without feeling crushed by the weight of it all. It was possible to pay rent, go to community college or SDSU, and hold a part-time job without being buried in debt. You didn't need a six-figure income to survive, let alone enjoy yourself. You could get a decent apartment with a couple of roommates and still have money left over to grab tacos, see a show at Soma, or catch a movie at the drive-in. It was a time when young people didn't feel completely locked out of the housing market before even starting their careers. You could drink on the beach without a SWAT team showing up, gather around a bonfire until late without worrying about noise ordinances, and cross into Tijuana for the night with little more than your ID and a few bucks in your pocket. Parking was easy. No parking apps, no surge pricing, no $30 valet services for a burrito and a beer. You didn't need reservations to eat at a good restaurant. There weren't 10-month wait lists for daycare. And the concept of paying $14 for a smoothie was still absurd. But the thing people remember most, more than the prices, more than the skyline, is the sense of space. There was physical space, yes. Room to drive without gridlock, room to hike without crowds, room to exist without bumping shoulders with 100 strangers every day. But there was also mental space. Life moved slower. The pace allowed you to breathe, to figure things out, to live without feeling like you were constantly behind. San Diego in the 1990s felt like a place where possibility still existed in a grounded, everyday way. You didn't have to be rich or famous to carve out a decent life. By comparison, today's San Diego feels like a very different place. The 90s were the last time the city truly felt like a big beach town. Relaxed, accessible, unfussy, rather than a polished, high-demand metroplex geared toward luxury development and tech startups. There were fewer luxury condos towering over neighborhoods, fewer investors gobbling up single-family homes, and fewer short-term vacation rentals pushing out long-time residents. It was a city made up mostly of locals, of people who lived and worked in the same zip codes for years. You knew your neighbors. You knew the cashier at the liquor store. There wasn't yet the sense that everything was being packaged for out-of-towners or sold to the highest bidder. And yes, it's true that many areas have improved over the years. North Park is thriving. The gas lamp is cleaner and safer. Barrio Logan is culturally vibrant and on the rise. There's more art, more food, more nightlife. But ask anyone who grew up in Mira Mesa, Ocean Beach La Mesa, Lemon Grove, or even Escondido. They'll tell you the same thing. San Diego in the 1990s wasn't perfect. It had its rough edges, its flaws, its dangers. But it was honest. It was lived in. It was full of personality. It had soul. It was gritty, unpolished, relaxed, and unmistakably real.
Come along, let's sing, where the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 19 on X, we're here just for you.